Dr. Shabazz here, and today I'm going to be covering Chapter 2. Chapter 2 in your book is called The Global Economic Environment. And while that doesn't sound very exciting, it is very relevant in terms of what is happening today. And in a couple of days, Joe Biden will become the 46th president of the United States. And a lot of countries, or a lot of leaders of countries, are kind of looking on with bated breath, trying to figure out where the U.S. is going. Because even today, America still has clout, economic clout. The dollar remains as the backbone of the economic system. But over the last several years, a lot of countries are wondering in which direction America is going. President Trump, when he was in office, rolled back a lot of treaties. He renegotiated others. He pulled out of some agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He renegotiated NAFTA, which is now known as the UMCA. And there were a number of other things that happened during his term, including this back and forth with China. And so we're in a very, very critical point in history, not to mention that the coronavirus has basically put a grinding halt to the global economy as we know it. And of course, this year in 2021, we hope to see some semblance of growth coming out of the pandemic. So today, what I'd like to do is talk about the global economic environment and some of the systems that countries employ in order to develop their internal economy, their economic engine. So let's get to Chapter 2, Global Economic Environment, and hopefully by the end of this video, you will have some different thoughts about the global economic environment and what it consists of. Consists of a lot of moving parts. And we're going to talk about some of the things you may have heard in the news. And I think we'll have a much better insight as to the way the global system works. So let's get started. Well, let's look at the world economy. We know over time it has evolved. You go all the way back to ancient times and they were doing barter and they were trading, going on these expeditions, on these boats, and people who were migrating and conducting trade. Yeah, it has come a long way. And of course, we got the whole system of currency and money. Now everybody's doing digital currency. They're basically trading zeros and ones, which are the binary bits that go through the network. Many of us use our debit cards, we use our credit cards, and we may not carry cash as we once did. And that is because of the type of system that we have now embraced. But in the early 20th century, we fast forward, we go past all of the antiquated trade methods, and we go to the 20th century, and particularly the second half, after the war ended in 1945, we go to the second half. At that time, the United States was the strongest power to come out of the war. Europe had to rebuild. So the United States gave them the Marshall Plan, which represented billions of dollars of assistance so that Europe can rebuild. There were some other things that helped Europe, including the creation of the World Bank and the IMF in 1944. The World Trade Organization was also created, chartered in 1948. The United Nations in 1945 that pledged to stop future world wars. And so far, they have done so. Of course, there have been a lot of different wars, but not one that has engulfed the entire globe in having different fronts of battle. So in the second half, you had these structures in place. And the dollar was the backbone of the system, and still is the backbone of the system, despite the fact that in the last several years, a lot of these countries are scratching their heads because they don't know which way America is going. President Trump pulled out of a lot of agreements. He got out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He got out of the Paris Accord. He renegotiated a number of agreements and got out of others. And so people were just wondering, what has become of America? Can we rely on America's strength going forward? Now, while all this is happening, we understand that China is a player on the block. They're a player. And now are the world's largest manufacturer in terms of exports. So you had a system where the U.S. was at the top. The dollar was king. Europe rebuilt after being devastated. In 1957, they signed the Treaty of Rome, saying that in 35 years they would launch an economic community, which in 92 became the European Union, which now has 27 members. And then in another 10 years, they would launch a currency, which became the euro. Not all the nations in the European Union are members of the Euro bloc. And you may remember that the United Kingdom was not in the Euro bloc. They still had the pound sterling, and they have since pulled out of the European Union. So a lot of things have changed, I would say, in the last 30 years. Things have really changed as far as when you talk about the rise of powers, the rise of China, the rise of the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and South Africa included. You had in the 90s, you had the Asian dragons. These were countries like Singapore, territories like Taiwan and Hong Kong, and you had nations that were on the rise, and we're talking about growth rates of 10%. And you have some others. You have the Mint nations, Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. That's a relatively new group. You have other emerging markets called the BIMs. Those may include, and some of these groups overlap, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, South Africa, Poland, Turkey, India, Indonesia, China, and South Korea. These are big emerging markets, or BIMs, B-E-M-S. And this article talks about the BIMs and why they are important. But this is a construct that you should make sure you memorize, because these buzzwords come out in conversations, and you want to make sure that you're up to date. And so they're talking about all these countries. Bear in mind, these are not all the BIMs. There are other ones, but these are the major ones that they wanted to highlight. We had a change in terms of the EU. I just talked about the Brexit, the United Kingdom pulling out of the European Union, and NAFTA being renegotiated. Now it is called the USMCA, United States, Mexico, Canada Agreement. Not a very creative title for the new agreement, but be that as it may, that is the reformulated NAFTA agreement. And so again, you have global competitors displacing and absorbing others, and you have a lot of consolidation. But some may argue that Are we deglobalizing? We talk about globalization, that is becoming more integrated, but then you have other nations, like with the Brexit vote in the United States, the posture that Donald Trump took in terms of becoming more insular, saying we need to bring jobs back home. And so you had a lot more isolationist activity that was also taking place. And so these are debates that are being had in many circles, political circles, geopolitical circles. Scholars are discussing this new world economy and the new balance of power with China, the U.S., and all these other nations competing for their role in the world economy. What has happened is capital movements have accelerated, and when you have an acceleration of capital in any entity, that may represent growth. Now, even when you have inflationary pressure, and we know inflation is because there's a lot of money in the system and there's excess demand, which means that all of this money in the system cannot find products. You have too much money chasing too few goods, which creates inflation, upward pressure on prices, and then you have a situation where the government may say we need to raise interest rates to pull more money out of the system and encourage people to save. But all of this capital flow has become very important. And before, it was that you were trading things. You were trading things. You were bringing in tons of cocoa or cashews or cotton. You were exporting tractors and cranes and other types of electronics. And so things were being traded. Now we have a lot of services being rendered. All types of services. Of course, goods are still being moved, but you have an acceleration of this digital transactions taking place. So you have, it says the world economy, not individual countries, is the dominating factor. And so we're moving away from the unipolar world where America is the center of the global economy, and now we have a lot of other players that are also competing for that space. New realities. Struggle between capitalism and socialism began in 1917, but also it was the Russian Revolution took place in 1917 with Vladimir Lenin. But they're saying it's over, and I don't believe it's over. I would respectfully disagree because I believe that China, which is inherently capitalist, even though it is a socialist country, it is inherently capitalist. I came across a couple of articles that I will show you here, but I'll first just show you this Google results. And I like to look at the Google results and see what is written, and you can see some of the articles about state capitalism, which is what it is called in China. And there were a couple of articles out of these results that I bookmarked. And this article was written by Rainer Zeidelman. And he is saying that China does not have a so-called state capitalist structure. He is saying that the private sector, which is the foundation of capitalism, is the main driver of China's economic growth. And here he has the skyline in Shanghai, which is very beautiful. Yeah, it looks very clear, but when I was there in 2008, they had a pollution problem that was absolutely awful. You smelled the diesel in the air, and it was just, if you had any respiratory issues, then that would not be the place you'd want to go. It looks like they've dealt with that issue. Or it might be a camera filter where they make it clear. But be that as it may, it's talking about China and the economic growth. But here's the paragraph that I want to bring your attention to. It says state capitalism is a misleading term, and it goes down to say capitalism is incompatible with a state economy in which companies are state-owned and planning authorities determine what is produced. Therefore, there can be no such thing as state capitalism. In truth, China is a mixed system that combines capitalism and socialism. Just like every other country in the world, this is equally true of the United States and European countries, all of which blend in different proportions capitalist and socialist elements in their system, which is very true. Most systems have a mixture of different systems that they've put together to fit their unique circumstances. Of course, in the United States, we've got other social safety nets. So we have unemployment that a lot of people are collecting now. We've got other benefits like Social Security. We have public schooling. We have things that provide basic goods to the citizenry. And how does the government get the money to distribute? Well, they get it from collecting taxes. So this is part of the system. And you find this in many countries where they have a very, very high tax threshold to pay for these social services. And you had a debate during the primaries of Bernie Sanders was citing Denmark as one of these places that had this socialist system. Democratic socialism in many of the Scandinavian countries have a mixture of socialist and free market activity. And Denmark made a response to Bernie Sanders by saying that they're not really socialist and they've just figured out a formula that works for them. But indeed, they do have socialism embedded in their system. They have just figured out a way to make it work very well as other countries like Sweden, Norway, and Finland. The countries up in the Scandinavian area have been able to accomplish great things. Looking at this article, 1989 and the birth of state capitalism in China. 1989 was the year of the Tiananmen uprising when pro-democracy students went to the square right across from the Forbidden City, and they protested for the Chinese government to open up the system and have democracy as they saw it. And of course, that revolution was brutally crushed, and I mean physically. They went to the square, and yes, there were lives lost as a result of the crackdown on the protesters. Something else happened around this time. You had the Soviet Union, which started to show cracks in their system and had been showing cracks leading up to this time. But in 1990, the Soviet Union collapsed. And pro-democracy advocate Boris Yeltsin took power. He was backed by the United States of America. And they went forth with a free market experiment, which actually failed. And you don't hear a lot about that. Some textbooks will cover the Russian experiment. And what happened was that Russia tried to usher in a free market system almost overnight. And the people simply were not ready for it. And their economy suffered as a result. But looking at China and the Soviet Union coming out of World War II had similar ideas. And in fact, the Soviet Union went over to China with their advisors saying, we'll help you lay out a system that will suit your social planning. But it got to the point where China said to the Soviet Union, look, we have a very different system here. We understand your system. We understand that your model, but your model is based on the working class or the proletariat rising to overthrow the bourgeoisie. But for us, it's the farmer. It is the peasant. So we have a totally different way of looking at where the revolution will take place. So eventually they parted ways, and it looked as if the Soviet Union was going to win the argument. 1990, they collapsed. And now you see China, after making many mistakes. China made a lot of mistakes. Even at some point, suffering from famine because their socialized experiment didn't produce enough food. And also the distribution system was very inefficient. So you had starvation that took place. But in 1972, they had a very influential leader, Deng Xiaoping, who decided that he was going to open up or at least entertain the opening of China's economic outlook on the world. And we're talking here 72, Nixon actually visited China, was the first American president to do so. And that kind of led to this opening. Similar to what Mikhail Gorbachev of the Soviet Union wanted for the Soviet Union, he wanted this opening. But China bided their time very slowly, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and now the early 2000s, they joined the WTO. They were ready. And by that time, they had developed a system of state capitalism that caught the world by surprise. By the time the other powers knew what was going on, China was growing at 10% rates. And they were exporting. And how does this work? Well, the government was in control of these private companies. And they gave directions as to what these private companies would produce. Now, it sounds mixed, and it is. It's a mixed system. But they figured out a way to benefit in the global system in ways that other nations were not. For example, America, it's illegal for the government to have a hand in a private company. Well, of course, China has a totally different system, and they created this economic engine, and again, it's the world's leading manufacturer. So it is very interesting when you look at the role of China. And I actually have a video that I would like to show you now on the rise of China. And you can get a look firsthand as to how this is working for China. And I would imagine this video is some years old, but you kind of get an idea of how that country is moving towards prosperity. So let's take a look at this video.
This is Shanghai, a 21st century metropolis that typifies modern China. It is a glistening city with space-age architecture and a population driven to build their own respective fortunes. Just this city alone, one of hundreds of cities in China, has a gross domestic product larger than countries like Sweden, Norway, and the United Arab Emirates. Yes, modern China has come a long way from where we left it in previous videos in this series. It is now the second largest economy in the world, and it looks poised to reclaim the title of the world's largest economy within the next century, which is a convenient segue to note that this video is the final video in the three-part series on the economy of China. Here we will be exploring modern-day China and what transformed it from a half-crippled failed state into the economic superpower that we know today. If you haven't already seen the first two videos in this series, I would encourage you to watch those as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be in order, but it is important to understand that China was once the world's most powerful economy, then it wasn't, and now it may be all over again. We were introduced to this man in the last video, Deng Xiaoping, the eventual successor of Chairman Mao, and this man is really important to understand because he epitomizes the Chinese transition from a socialist state with a centrally planned everything to the mixed market economy that we see today. Deng Xiaoping was still a devout communist who subscribed heavily to the teachings of the party and communist literature, but as with all literature, he saw compromise in the understanding of how these teachings would apply to his beloved nation. Chairman Mao was, well, let's say a bit of a stickler for the idea that all men are born equal and nobody should be better than anyone else. During the Cultural Revolution, if you were too rich or too smart or too different, you were most likely going to be labelled as a class enemy, which was really not good. This was an effective tool for exerting the rule of the party through devout subservience under the fear of death for stepping out of line, but was really terrible for the economy. Punishments for people that went above and beyond meant that the Chinese population made being mediocre an art form, which when mixed with some failed experiments meant that the nation was struggling to feed itself and its bold industrial plans were falling behind. So a different approach was needed. Deng Xiaoping always fell on the more easygoing side of the Communist Manifesto book club. He believed that resources should still be allocated by the state, but he also believed that high-performing workers or managers should be rewarded, not executed. Crazy, I know. An important side note is that Deng Xiaoping was never actually president or chairman or any kind of head of state over China. He was the chairman of the Central Advisory Committee, which wasn't a government role, but it was an appointment inside of the Communist Party. A better way of understanding this is that Donald Trump is currently the president of the United States and a member of the Republican Party, but he is not the head of the Republican Party. A lady named Ronna McDaniel is the leader of the American Republican Party. So within the party, she technically outranks him, but he is also president and she doesn't really hold on to any position within the American government. It's all a bit weird, but even more so in the case of China, because the Chinese Communist Party is the government, so the lines are even a little bit more blurry. What this meant in reality though was that Deng Xiaoping had more of an oversight advisory role to whoever the head of state actually was. It was a whole big thing. But anyway, what is important is that in 1976, the current head of state, Huo Gaofang, with Deng Xiaoping rolled out the Chinese modernization program, which had a few big initiatives to turn the Chinese economy around. The first big one was rewarding good workers with recognition and a larger allocation of government welfare, as well as rewarding managers of the factories and farms across the nation that hit or exceeded their targets. This avoided a lot of the incentives that workers and managers had to deliberately underperform in the previous system, and now, for the first time in over 4 decades, actually rewarded solid effort. On top of this, the plan also called for giving a lot of the process control back to the managers of these enterprises. Deng Xiaoping realised that having party officials flexing their authority over production lines of the country was counterproductive, and decided that the factory managers and farm managers of the nation should actually be ultimately responsible for the processes within their facilities. Again, crazy, I know. This wasn't to say that party officials lost their teeth altogether though. If a facility was underperforming, then they had the authority to get involved and fix things up as they saw fit. So there was still a carrot and stick. It's just that the two were orientated in the right direction. The carrot for productiveness and the stick for laziness. Now this whole system actually got off to a bit of an unfortunate start. Despite being a much more robust economic policy than the Maoist guidelines previously in place, the rollout of the new system coincided with some of the coldest winters in Chinese history, resulting in widespread failed crops. Now this was argued by many to be the failing of the system, and hey, we should just go back and revert to everything that we were doing before. But there was a glimmer of hope in the industrial sector. In the 2 short years that this plan was rolled out over, the industrial output of the nation had jumped by over 30%, just between the years of 1977 and 1979, which was the most drastic period of growth the country had ever witnessed. So, there was probably something to be said for this whole system, but things were about to get even crazier than that. Throughout its entire history of prosperity or oppression, China had been an economy that relied almost exclusively on its domestic market. It had been the world's largest economy up until the end of the 19th century, not because of colonialism or trade, but because it had a lot of productive people and an abundance of farmland to feed itself. It had at times been strong-armed into trading with colonial powers that were interested in its tea and spices, but that was far from the cornerstone of the national economy. The Chinese government, with the guidance of Deng Xiaoping, decided to see the potential of international trade. At this time, China was obsessed with the idea of self-sufficiency, and there was a lot of surface-level arguments that supported this ideology. China was supposedly a workers' paradise. Why would they utilise labour from overseas to make things that could have otherwise been made by a Chinese worker? Likewise, why would they send something Chinese-made overseas when it could have remained in China to contribute to the wealth of the nation? On top of this, China was a communist nation that found itself in an increasingly hostile world at this time. It wanted to have the security of being able to look after itself in a world that didn't really like it. These were all fair points, but Deng Xiaoping decided that the time had come where the advantages outweighed the cost. Now, the advantages of a global trade are massive to countries that can effectively engage in it. We have explored this in depth with the video on foreign exchange, but briefly, there are things that some countries will do well and some countries will do badly. If everybody tries to do the things that they are good at and bad at, well, that's okay, but it is better perhaps that everybody focuses on what they do well and just trade with the difference. At this point, China had actually become pretty good at manufacturing. Their infrastructure was okay, but their manpower was monumental. They weren't going to be building anything high-tech yet, like cars or aeroplanes, but low-cost, low-tech manufacturing was kind of their forte. They needed to produce everything a poor nation needed, which made them really good at producing cheap things. Also, ironically enough, it had become pretty terrible at farming. Things like the farming collectives, the backyard furnace experiments, and the exploding population growth meant that once ample Chinese farmland was struggling to keep up with the needs of the nation. This wasn't an open the floodgates type deal though. The Chinese government embraced international trade in a very Chinese government way, only opening it up initially to areas that it classed as special economic zones. These were regions like Shenzhen, which was conveniently positioned right next to Hong Kong, which was kind of its own special economic zone at this point. It also opened it up to other areas like Guangzhou and of course Shanghai. These became areas that were still very much part of China, but were allowed certain liberties. The first of these was the fact that they were allowed ports to conduct international trade. But later these limitations got even more liberal. They were allowed to own private enterprise and foreign direct investments were allowed. Then people were allowed to buy real estate and foreign goods, and very quickly these special economic zones started to look like every other world city in every other country around the world. And people got rich. Very rich. Which was great, but also terrible. Remember how China was a socialist nation under the rule of a communist party? Well, having a whole lot of people becoming very rich kind of went contrary to this whole deal. The rules of these special economic zones facilitated this kind of wealth, but it made people outside of these cities rightfully envious. Bizarrely enough though, this was all kind of part of the plan. Deng Xiaoping was most famously noted for saying that he wanted everybody to get rich, but for that to happen, some people were going to have to get rich first. Today, the People's Republic of China is by no stretch of the imagination a socialist state. The policies that dictated the prosperity of special economic zones have for the most part overflown into all regions in China. But that does not mean that everybody was equally blessed by these policies. China is now an economy based on services and manufacturing. Farming, which was once the foundation of this economy, is barely a side thought in China's annual output, which has caused huge divides. The cities of China were in the right place at the right time to develop in line with the world economy as it embraced globalization. Shipping containers and international trade deals were formulated as China was perfecting the art of producing what the world wanted. These policies led to the most intense period of economic development the world had ever seen. China went from a nation barely able to feed itself to the second largest economy in the world in less time than The Simpsons has been on air. China wasn't even open for trade when the first mobile phones were being sold, and now it is almost impossible to find one that wasn't made there. The wealth of this nation has been largely responsible for the greatest period in human history, as billions have been pulled out of absolute poverty and into the modern world. But that is not to say poverty still doesn't exist. Remember when some people got rich first? Well, those people weren't necessarily the smartest or the most innovative or even the hardest working. Those people were Communist Party officials that were lucky enough to be situated in these special economic zones. Today, the Chinese economy is of course a remarkable thing, but it is still, in a sense, very much a government-controlled and centrally planned economy. Sure, on paper it now has entrepreneurs and independent companies, it has stock markets and super yachts, buyouts and billionaires, but it is still ultimately at the will of the government who succeeds and who doesn't. Many people are under the impression that China has achieved such economic success because their government eased control over aspects of the economy, but in reality, they just changed their strategy. Today, the Chinese Communist Party has just as much influence over China as it did during the Cultural Revolution. It just so happens to be a more prosperous place because it enacted good economic ideas. It is difficult to determine where China is going, and there is no better way to embarrass an economist than to ask them to predict the future, but there are a few things that we can take away from understanding the history of its economy. For starters, it certainly has the capacity to be the world's most powerful economy. For most of recorded history, it has been. The 20th century was more of an anomaly in that sense. But if it does take the top spot, it will be a very different nation to what it was before. The country suffered under an authoritarian rule. Poor people just looking for their next meal are easy to rule over, but it can't be maintained forever. It is possible that the wealth that China has embraced may liberate it from this kind of rule, and it is equally likely that it will just continue to prosper underneath it. Realistically, we are likely to see a slowdown in the Chinese economy. 20 years before the Chinese economic miracle, there was the Japanese economic miracle, a nation that established itself as the workshop of the world that eventually transitioned into a serviced economy and then slowly into a comfortable equilibrium. The two nations are obviously very different in many regards, but oftentimes looking at history is the best way to determine the future.
As we look at economic systems, we kind of understand what an economic system is. An economic system is designed to create a fluid or a flow of goods and services that are offered to its citizens. It is designed to offer sustenance. It is designed to offer some choices of basic needs, and in some cases wants. Needs and wants are different. But then you have a structure of an economic system that is managed by the government. And so it says here, what type of government do you have? A monarchy, dictatorship, tyrant. Those are not really government systems. It's a state of being. A dictatorship is a state of being. A tyrant is a person who perhaps is ruling in the absence of equilibrium in the government, because you should have balance in the government. And perhaps a tyrant or a dictator is one who is ruling in a system that is not balanced. So you have all these different systems, different flavors of socialism, as I just stated, different flavors of free market economics, different monarchies. You have different systems that have religion as the center. And so you have a lot of different forms of government. There are literally dozens of types of governments, and we only think of socialism and free market. We think about democracy. We think about socialism. That's what we hear about. We think about democracy, but there are many, many different types, including one. I'll just give you one of them called gerontocracy. What is a gerontocracy? Well, it comes from the root gerent, or old. Gerontocracy means rulership by the old. And so you may have a council of elders, you have a decision to make, you go to the council of elders, and because of their wisdom, they decide, okay, we're going to make this decision because the council of elders said that this is direction to go. They have the most wisdom, so then we take that action. So you have a number of different types of governmental system that should make sure that the economic system is running in a fluid way. The WTO also ensures that world trade runs in a fluid way through free trade and making sure that certain rights are protected in this global system. You also have this idea of currency trading, countries trading with each other. And when you trade goods, unless it's a barter situation, you're going to have to change your currency for theirs. And you have something called currency speculation, where people buy and sell currencies because they're hedging. They're moving in and out of different markets, international markets, and so they have to engage in hedging strategies. Of course, we are in a service-oriented economy. Services provided by the state or state-funded, pensions, healthcare, education. I talked about this country having a social safety net, remnants of socialism in the American system. You don't hear about it a lot, but that's what they're describing here. You have institutions. So we have institutions. We're hearing a lot now about our institutions because of the impeachment proceedings. We hear about the balance of power. We heard during the conferring of the electoral votes, the vice president, who was presiding over the meeting, did not have the requisite power to overturn the electors' votes. And so that's a system of balance there. Now, if you say to Mike Pence, as President Trump did, hey, overturn the election, now that is remnants of another type of system. We talked about being a dictatorship. That's essentially what you would have. Or you would have some kind of oligarch. You have an oligarchy. That's basically a system run by the elite or by the few, and you would disregard the vote of the people. So that was the counter argument. So in this economic system, it says entrepreneurial, high risk, high reward. You go into a business, there's overhead costs, there is a risk, but potentially, maybe some years down the road, you will be able to gain a reward because it takes time, the product life cycle, people to learn about your product. Then you introduce it, it grows, it matures, you continue to improve the product to extend the product life cycle, but eventually it declines. So you have introduction, growth, maturity, decline. And that's generally what you have with certain products and markets. So here are some of the economic systems where you have market capitalism. Now, we're talking about the United States and many other countries in Western Europe, including Switzerland and many of the European Union countries. Centrally planned capitalism. This is what we were talking about with China. And some of those countries that have experimented with a mixture of systems. Actually, when I was in Cuba, we were talking to a guy that was leading us around, and he says, yeah, we understand, this issue with America wanting us to accept free market. But yeah, we want to do things on our own terms. He said we just redid the Constitution, and what we're doing is we took a little bit from a lot of the best systems in the world, and we want to create something that is uh, suited for Cuba on our terms and not America's terms. And he was very passionate when he said that. Speaking of Cuba, you talk about market socialism. Um, Now, of course, Cuba has had some slight reforms trying to entertain more private ownership and move into market socialism. Now, it's still mostly centrally planned, but when we talk about market socialism, we're talking about the Denmarks, and we're talking about Sweden, and we're talking about countries that have a very heavy graduated tax to pay for all these wonderful services. And we talk about maternity leave, we talk about free education, free healthcare. Some of these remnants actually exist in France, in England. In fact, France has a very heavy socialist tradition. We're going into the mid 1800s, where you had the workers' parties in countries like France and Italy. Labor unions were very strong, and they were fighting against the elite. And so that tradition still lives in France. And you have these very, very generous social services for its citizens. And it is very interesting that this remains the most powerful nation and the wealthiest, but in terms of some of the services that are rendered, this country struggles. This country struggles with healthcare, struggles with education, it struggles with taking care of its elderly, and it struggles with ensuring safety. We talk about criminal justice. I mean, all these things are these are just points of discussion in the political discourse of America. So it's very interesting times that we live in. Here you have some of the groupings that I mentioned before. I'll just go past that. These are some of the hallmarks of economic freedom. And I actually had a website where it had the rankings, and if I can find it, I'll bring it up. So here is a site, 2020 Index of Economic Freedom, and I just want to show you this because if you were doing a project, let's say you graduate from here and you're doing a project, international marketing, and they put you on a project, you should know what kind of sites to look at, because this site here, Index of Economic Freedom, has a lot of resources. And they even have color-coded maps, and they have a lot of different data. They even give you the definition of economic freedom, where it talks about in an economically free society, individuals are free to work, produce, consume, and invest in any way they please. And then they give the benefits and all of these other types of information. And some of these types of sites, if you want more specific data, then there's probably a subscription fee. But here you have some country rankings of economic freedom. Singapore is number 1, Hong Kong, New Zealand, Australia, Switzerland, and Ireland. And then you have all the others in succession. Where's the United States? Number 17. This is economic freedom. Very interesting. Here's something you should commit to memory. The Group of Seven, or the G7, United States, Japan, Germany, France, Britain, and 2 that many may not guess. If you ask them the G7, They'll get the first 5, but they may struggle on the last 2, Canada and Italy. Russia was part of the G8, but their membership was suspended because of the invasion of Crimea, which actually happened. It was interesting because this happened before Trump came into power. But Trump was asked about the situation, and he did not know at that time that Russia had already annexed Crimea. And that was 2 years before he came into office. It just shows you this is why you need to be up to date on current events so you don't make those types of mistakes. That was very embarrassing for a head of state not to know that a region he's engaged in is in the midst of this crisis, and he was unaware. Balance of payments, and we're getting to some financial issues here. Balance of payments is based on double entry bookkeeping, where both sides, the debits and the credits, have to balance. It is an account of a country's activities, both short-term movements, and we're talking about imports and exports, and then we talk about the capital account or long-term investment. We're talking about portfolios. We might be talking about things like gold and other assets that are owned abroad over a long period of time. So this is the balance of payments. And again, the current account is where most of the action happens because of the trade flows, the imports and the exports. Here you have the exporters, the leading exporters. I mentioned China being number 1. The leading importers, U.S. is number 1. And here we talk about the finance, international finance and trade flows, currency flows. Foreign exchange allows companies to do business globally with different currencies. If you're in a foreign country, if you set up shop, you may have to buy property. You may have to buy other merchandise to get up and running. Well, somewhere along the way, you have to exchange your dollars for the local currency because that's the currency they operate in. And this allows exchanges to happen. And the thing of it is, if you're in a country, they want you to exchange your currency for theirs, so that way that's more hard currency coming in. And that means that the greater the demand for their currency, the faster it grows. If your currency continues to circulate, that means people have a demand for something you have. And so your economy continues to grow as trade is taking place. There is an exchange risk when the value of currency fluctuates. If I'm let's say that you have I have a trading partner, and let's say they owe me $1,000. And in our contract, it is $1,000 US that they have to pay me. Somewhere along the way, that person is going to have to change their currency for $1,000 to pay me, right? Now, if they have the equivalent amount of $1,000 in their currency, they can pay me now and be done, right? Now, if they say that, well, can you give me a week to get my money together and I'll give you the $1,000? And I say, okay, I'll give you another week. That week comes and goes. My partner, his currency has depreciated in value. What does that now mean for that $1,000? it means now that it takes them more of their currency to come up with $1,000. So they actually suffer from risk exposure because it is incumbent upon them to exchange their currency for the equal amount of $1,000. I get my $1,000 regardless of what happens. They're the ones that suffer from risk exposure. And so you have these situations where you have currency fluctuations that can certainly affect transactions, particularly in unstable economies where your currency fluctuates so wildly. You do have some measures against that, such as forward market, what they call hedging, buying your currency in advance. Devaluation is more technical because devaluation is usually when a government decides that they're going to lower the value of their own currency. Why would they do that? Well, they would do that when a lower value will help boost exports because now their products are cheaper to the importer. That might be a reason to lower your currency. It also attracts investment into your own economy because now potential investors, their money goes further because you've devalued your currency, and now that may attract capital investment. And so that's another reason for devaluation. Devaluation is government driven. Revaluation is also government driven. So distinguish the difference between depreciation, appreciation, devaluation, revaluation. One is government instituted and the other is market driven. So you have two different concepts there. Here's a problem. When you talk about market dynamics, you get a chance to see what the contract, and it's similar to the problem that I just told you about, but you can see the currency rates here. On a $1 million contract, the American receives $1 million regardless of what happens. But given the exchange rate here, that will determine how much the European needs in terms of euros to make up the $1 million, right? So here, $1 million is equal to 1.25 million euros. And let's say that European waits let's say they wait 90 days and the euro goes to this amount here, 85.85 equal $1. Now they're only required to pay 850,000 euro. Because what has happened here to the euro? It's strengthened. It takes fewer euros to make up a dollar. So the euro has strengthened. Thus, that means it takes fewer euros to make up the 1 million. Now, they have a different scenario. If this is denominated in euros, now the American bears risk exposure because they're receiving euros. And of course, their euros have to be converted into dollars, right? And the euros is 1,100,000. So if the American in this case takes the euros and converts them using this rate, this is how much they're getting. In this case, since the euro appreciated, the dollar depreciated. And so you have these relative values here. Okay, so those of you who had me for global business will remember the exercises that we did in the third exam where we went through the currency calculations, and so this is just a kind of a little review of that. So hopefully everybody is being safe. I'll give you more updates in terms of the in-person classes and how that's going to play out. Hopefully they'll straighten it out. But other than that, I hope to see you later on this week, and if not this week, I'll see you certainly in the classroom next Tuesday. Okay? Take care.